A vow that couldn't be broken. Juliana De Luca had spent her life pretending she could escape the world her father built. But when he was executed, she became a prize one claimed by Salvatore Costa, the man her father had sworn would never touch her. He tilted her chin up, his touch deceptively gentle. "You were never supposed to be mine," he murmured.
"But now, I don't let go."
Chapter 1. The Legacy of Shadows. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, hung in the air, a morbid perfume that failed to mask the metallic tang of blood. Juliana De Luca knelt beside her father's body, the cold marble of the mausoleum floor seeping through the thin silk of her black dress. Around her, the whispers of the famiglia buzzed like angry bees, their words a blend of grief, fear, and speculation. But Juliana heard nothing, saw nothing but the waxy stillness of her father's face, a face that had always seemed invincible, carved from the very stone of their ancient lineage. Don Antonio De Luca, the Lion of Palermo, had been a force of nature, a man who ruled his empire with an iron fist and a surprisingly gentle heart, at least when it came to his only daughter. Now he was gone, felled by a sniper's bullet as he stepped out of his favorite trattoria, a place where he had dined for decades, a place that had always felt untouchable, sacred. Juliana traced the line of his jaw, her fingers trembling. She remembered the way he used to smooth her hair, the rough calluses on his hands catching on the strands, a tactile reminder of the duality of his existence, the tenderness he reserved for her, the ruthlessness he displayed to the world. "Papa," she whispered, the word catching in her throat, thick with unshed tears. "What am I going to do?" A shadow fell over her, and a hand, large and warm, covered hers. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Marco, her father's consigliere, his most trusted advisor, and, for the past few years, Juliana's almost fiancé. Almost, because Antonio had always hesitated, claiming she was too young, that Marco was too embedded in the life. Juliana had suspected the real reason was that her father couldn't bear to let her go, to relinquish his control, even to a man he trusted implicitly. "Juliana," Marco said softly, his voice a low rumble that usually soothed her. Today, it grated on her raw nerves. "We need to go. It's not safe here." She looked up at him then, her eyes dry and burning. Marco was handsome, in a dark, brooding way, with eyes that could be both kind and calculating. He had always been kind to her, patient, understanding. But now, she saw a flicker of something else in his gaze, something that made her stomach clench with unease. It was ambition, raw and untamed, leaping to life in the vacuum of her father's death. "Safe?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Where is safe, Marco?" "My father built this world, brick by bloody brick. He said it was to protect me, to protect us." And now she gestured towards the lifeless form on the cold marble. Where was his protection? Marco's hand tightened on hers. "He made enemies, Juliana. Powerful enemies. You know this."
She did know it.
She had grown up in the shadow of her father's power, a world of whispered conversations, coded messages, and sudden, unexplained absences. A world where loyalty was paramount and betrayal was a death sentence. A world she had always tried to pretend didn't exist, retreating into her books, her music, her carefully cultivated garden, a small oasis of normalcy in a landscape of violence and fear. "Who, Marco?" she asked, her voice sharp, the grief momentarily eclipsed by a surge of anger. "Who did this?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, towards the entrance of the mausoleum, where two of her father's most loyal soldiers stood guard, their faces grim, their hands never straying far from the weapons concealed beneath their dark suits. "There are rumors," he said finally, his voice low. "Whispers." The Costas, the name hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. The Costas, her father's oldest and most bitter rivals. A family who had been locked in a bloody feud with the De Lucas for generations, a feud that had claimed countless lives on both sides. A feud that Juliana had always believed was ancient history, a relic of a bygone era.
Salvatore Costa.
The name was a legend, a whisper in the dark. The current head of the Costa family, a man rumored to be even more ruthless, more cunning than her father had been. A man her father had sworn would never touch her, a vow that had been sealed in blood, or so she had believed. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The lilies, the blood, the whispers, the weight of her father's legacy, it was all too much. She swayed, and Marco caught her, his arms surprisingly strong. "We need to leave, Juliana," he repeated, his voice urgent.
Now.
Before what? Before the Costas came to claim their prize? Before the fragile peace her father had brokered shattered completely, unleashing a new wave of violence and bloodshed? Before she became a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game that had already claimed her father's life? He helped her to her feet, his grip firm, almost possessive. As they walked towards the waiting car, Juliana felt a chilling premonition, a sense of impending doom that settled over her like a shroud. She looked back at the mausoleum, at the cold, silent tomb where her father lay. The legacy of shadows had fallen upon her, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life would never be the same. The carefully constructed walls of her pretend world had crumbled, and she was now exposed, vulnerable and utterly alone, caught in the crosshairs of a war she hadn't chosen, a war that was about to engulf her completely. The thought of Salvatore Costa, a faceless phantom in her nightmares, sent a shiver of fear, and something else, something she couldn't quite name, through her. It was a strange, unsettling premonition of a fate she couldn't escape. Chapter 2. A gilded cage unveiled. The villa was opulent, a sprawling estate perched on a cliff overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was a masterpiece of Italian architecture, with terracotta roofs, sun-drenched walls, and lush gardens that tumbled down towards the turquoise water. But to Juliana, it felt like a prison, a gilded cage crafted from marble and fear. She had been brought here, not by Marco, but by Salvatore Costa himself. He had arrived at the funeral, a dark figure amidst the mourning, his presence radiating a silent power that had sent a ripple of fear through the assembled mourners. He had approached her with a chilling courtesy, his eyes, the color of deep sea, holding hers with an intensity that had made her breath catch. "Signorina De Luca," he had said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that belied the steel beneath. "My condolences on your loss. Your father was a formidable man." The understatement was almost mocking, but Juliana had held her head high, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't quite feel. "Thank you, Signor Costa." He had offered her his arm, a gesture that was both an offer and a command. She had hesitated for only a moment, knowing that refusal was not an option. The silent threat in his eyes, the subtle pressure of his hand on her elbow, had told her everything she needed to know. She was his now, a prize claimed in the aftermath of a brutal power shift. Marco had protested, of course, his face a mask of fury and frustration. But Salvatore had silenced him with a single, dismissive glance. "This is a matter between families, Marco," he had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be dealt with accordingly." The drive to the villa had been silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Juliana had sat stiffly, staring out the window at the passing scenery, her mind racing. She had tried to tell herself that this was a temporary arrangement, a necessary precaution to prevent further bloodshed. That Salvatore Costa, despite his reputation, was a man of honor, bound by the ancient codes of the Famiglia. But the cold, hard knot of fear in her stomach told her otherwise. She had seen the way he looked at her, a possessive gleam in his eyes that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with ownership. Now, standing on the balcony of her lavishly appointed room, she gazed out at the endless expanse of the sea. The beauty of the view, the gentle breeze, the warmth of the sun on her skin, none of it could penetrate the icy fear that gripped her. She was trapped, isolated, surrounded by enemies she didn't know, in a world she didn't understand. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding, to see a young woman standing hesitantly in the doorway. She was petite, with dark, curly hair and wide, anxious eyes. "Signorina," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Signor Costa requests your presence at dinner." Juliana nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She followed the woman through the labyrinthine corridors of the villa, her footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. The dining room was vast, with a long, mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. But tonight, only 2 places were set, at opposite ends of the table. Salvatore Costa was already seated, his back to the window, his face half-shadowed. He rose as she entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed almost mocking in its formality. "Signorina De Luca," he said, his voice smooth and low. "Please join me." She walked towards him, her steps measured, her head held high. She would not show him fear. She would not give him the satisfaction. He pulled out a chair for her, his hand brushing hers as he did so. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange mixture of fear and something else. Something that made her skin prickle and her heart beat faster. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The table was laden with food, a feast of antipasti, pasta, seafood, and wine. But Juliana had no appetite. She picked at her food, her stomach churning with anxiety. Salvatore watched her, his gaze intense, unwavering. He ate with a slow, deliberate grace, savoring each bite. He seemed completely at ease, as if this were a perfectly normal dinner, not a forced encounter between captor and captive. "You are quiet, signorina," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Is the food not to your liking?" "The food is fine," she replied, her voice steady. "I am simply not hungry." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Grief can do that," he said. "It can steal your appetite, your sleep, your very will to live." He spoke as if he understood, as if he had experienced such loss himself. Juliana looked at him, searching his face for any sign of genuine empathy. But his expression was unreadable, a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "My father was murdered," she said, her voice sharp. "He was betrayed. By your family." He didn't flinch. "Your father was a powerful man, signorina. He made enemies. That is the nature of our world. And you are one of those enemies," she said, her voice rising. "You killed him." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I did not kill your father, signorina," he said, his voice dangerously low. "But I will not deny that his death benefits me." The honesty of his words, the cold, calculated ruthlessness, took her breath away. She stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was alone with him, a predator in his lair, and she had no one to turn to, no one to protect her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air. He had made no pretense of innocence, no attempt to soften the blow. He was laying bare the brutal truth of their situation, and she was utterly at his mercy. The game had begun, and she was a pawn, with no control over her fate. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Fallen Empire. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Juliana pushed her plate away, the rich aroma of the food suddenly nauseating. She couldn't bear to sit there, playing this charade of civility with a man who, if not directly responsible for her father's death, certainly profited from it. "Why am I here, Signor Costa?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. "What do you want from me?" He regarded her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to pierce through her, stripping away her defenses, laying bare her fear and vulnerability. Then, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "You are here, Juliana," he said, using her given name for the first time, the sound sending an unexpected shiver down her spine, "because you are a De Luca, the last of your line. And in our world, lineage is everything." She frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "My father is dead." The De Luca Empire, she hesitated, the word feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. "It is gone." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Not gone, Juliana. Merely transferred. Your father built a powerful organization, a network of influence that spans continents. That power doesn't simply vanish with his death. It needs a guiding hand. And you believe that hand is yours? She challenged, her voice rising in defiance. It is, he said simply, his confidence unshakable. By right of conquest. By right of tradition.
Tradition? She scoffed.
You call murder and theft tradition? He sighed, a hint of impatience in his voice. The feud between our families is older than you or I, Juliana. It is a dance of power, a constant struggle for dominance. Your father understood this. He played the game, and he lost. And I am the prize? She asked, her voice bitter. The spoils of war? He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but it sent a jolt of awareness through her, a confusing mix of fear and something else. Something that made her skin tingle and her breath catch in her throat. You are more than a prize, Juliana, he said, his voice low and husky. You are a key to uniting our families, to ending the bloodshed, to forging a new era of peace and prosperity. She stared at him, disbelief warring with a flicker of hope. Could he be serious? Could this ruthless, dangerous man actually be offering her a way out, a chance to escape the cycle of violence that had consumed her family for generations?
How?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. How can I possibly? He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. By marrying me, Juliana, he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a still pond. By becoming my wife, the Donna to my Dawn. By bearing my children, the heirs to a united empire. The proposal, so blunt, so unexpected, left her reeling. She pulled her hand away, her mind racing. Marriage? To him? To the man who represented everything she had always feared and despised? It was unthinkable.
Impossible.
And yet a part of her, a small, treacherous part, felt a flicker of something. Not love, not even attraction, but curiosity. Fascination. He was a powerful, compelling figure, a man who exuded an aura of danger and control that was both terrifying and intriguing. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint of mockery. But his expression was serious, his eyes filled with a strange intensity that made her heart beat faster. I need time, she stammered, her voice shaking. I need to think. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes.
Of course, he said.
You have been through a great deal. I will not rush you, but I will ask you to consider this, Juliana. Your father is gone. Marco is not the man you think he is. I am the only one who can protect you. I am the only one who can offer you a future. His words hung in the air, a mixture of threat and promise. She knew he was right, at least in part. Marco's ambition, his sudden shift in demeanor after her father's death, had unnerved her. She no longer trusted him, no longer felt safe in his presence. And Salvatore, despite her fear, despite her hatred for his family, she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt towards him, the sense of inevitability that had settled over her since their first encounter. He was a force of nature, a storm that had swept into her life, and she was caught in its vortex, powerless to resist. He had given her a choice, but it felt like no choice at all. The whispers of her fallen empire echoed in her ears, reminding her of the duty she now carried, the legacy she was bound to uphold, even if it meant sacrificing her own desires. The decision felt like a weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Chapter 4. The Serpent's Gentle Grasp. The days that followed were a blur of strained politeness and unspoken tension. Juliana remained a prisoner in the opulent villa, her movements restricted, her every interaction with Salvatore carefully orchestrated. He was unfailingly courteous, treating her with a respect that bordered on deference, yet she was always aware of the underlying power dynamic, the steel beneath the velvet glove. He began to include her in his daily routine, subtly, gradually drawing her into his world. She sat in on meetings with his consigliere, listening to discussions of business deals, territorial disputes, and the delicate balance of power within the famiglia. She observed the way he commanded respect, the way his men deferred to him, the way he could silence a room with a single glance. He showed her the villa, its hidden passages, its secret rooms, its history etched in stone and whispered in the portraits of his ancestors. He told her stories of his family, of the long and bloody feud with the DeLucas, of the sacrifices made, the battles fought, the lives lost. He spoke of his father, a man he clearly revered, a man who had been killed by Antonio DeLuca's men, a loss that had shaped him, hardened him, fueled his ambition to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Juliana listened, her initial fear slowly giving way to a grudging respect and a growing understanding of the man behind the mask. He was ruthless, yes, but he was also intelligent, strategic, and surprisingly honorable, at least within the twisted code of the mafia. He never pressured her for an answer to his proposal, but his presence was a constant reminder of the decision she had to make, the weight of her family's legacy pressing down on her. He would often find her in the gardens, staring out at the sea, lost in thought. He would approach her silently, his presence a comforting weight in the vast emptiness of her new reality. One evening, he found her sitting by the fountain, the water cascading down the marble statues, the sound a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in her heart. "The sea calls to you," he observed, his voice low and resonant. She nodded, not turning to look at him. "It reminds me of freedom, of a life I can no longer have." He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne, a blend of citrus and spice that had become strangely familiar. "Freedom is an illusion, Juliana," he said softly. "We are all prisoners of something. Our past, our families, our obligations. And you believe marriage to you is my only escape?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers. "I believe it is your best option," he said, his voice sincere. "I can offer you protection, security, a place in the world, and perhaps, in time, something more." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. The something more he offered hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. She was aware of his attraction to her, the way his eyes lingered on her, the subtle brush of his hand against hers, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. And she was not immune. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but there was something about him, a magnetism, a raw power that drew her in, despite her fear, despite her resentment. "I don't love you," she said, the words blunt, honest. He smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. "Love is a luxury we cannot always afford, Juliana," he said. "Respect, loyalty, trust, these are the foundations of a strong marriage, a strong famiglia." "And what about my family?" she asked. "My father's legacy?" "Your father's legacy will be honored," he assured her. "Our families will be united, not destroyed. The DeLuca name will live on, through our children, through the empire we will build together." His words, his vision of the future, painted a picture that was both terrifying and alluring. A future where the bloodshed ended, where the two warring families became one, where she could find a place, a purpose, a sense of belonging. But at what cost? Her freedom? Her heart? Her very soul? She stood up, restless, unable to sit still any longer. She walked to the edge of the fountain, her fingers trailing in the cool water. "I still need time," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He rose and stood behind her, his hands hovering near her shoulders, but not touching. She could feel his breath on her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. "Time is a precious commodity, Juliana," he said softly. "Do not waste it." Then, he placed a gentle kiss at her nape, a shockingly intimate act that he didn't linger on, and walked away, leaving her in the growing darkness. The serpent had offered the apple, and she was dangerously close to taking a bite. The gentle grasp was tightening, almost imperceptibly, but she felt it, the subtle pressure, the closing of the trap. Chapter 5. Echoes of Betrayal and Blood. Juliana found herself drawn to the villa's library, a vast, cavernous room filled with ancient tomes, leather-bound manuscripts, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of Costas. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating pressure of her present and lose herself in the stories of the past. She spent hours poring over old family records, tracing the history of the feud between the DeLucas and the Costas, a tangled web of betrayal, revenge, and bloodshed that stretched back centuries. She learned of alliances forged and broken, of oaths sworn and violated, of love affairs that had blossomed and withered amidst the violence. She discovered that the feud had not always been so bitter. There had been times of peace, of cooperation, even of intermarriage between the two families. But these periods of harmony had always been fragile, shattered by acts of treachery, by the insatiable hunger for power that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of their existence. One name kept recurring in the records: Isabella DeLuca, Juliana's great-grandmother, a woman renowned for her beauty, her intelligence, and her fierce loyalty to her family. She had been betrothed to Alessandro Costa, the heir to the Costa Empire, a union that was meant to seal a lasting peace between the two families. But the marriage had never taken place. Isabella had been murdered on the eve of her wedding, poisoned by a jealous rival, a woman from a lesser family who had coveted Alessandro for herself. The Costas had blamed the DeLucas, accusing them of orchestrating the assassination to prevent the alliance. The DeLucas had vehemently denied the accusation, claiming that Isabella had been a victim of internal Costa treachery. The truth, Juliana realized, was lost in the mists of time, obscured by layers of accusation and counter-accusation, fueled by grief and rage. But the consequences of Isabella's death had been devastating, plunging the two families into a new cycle of violence that had continued, with only brief interludes of peace, to this day. As Juliana delved deeper into the history, she began to see parallels between Isabella's story and her own. She, too, was a DeLuca, betrothed to a Costa, a union that was meant to end the bloodshed. But could she succeed where Isabella had failed? Could she break the cycle of violence, or was she doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? One evening, Salvatore found her in the library, surrounded by stacks of ancient books. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking. "You are fascinated by the past, Juliana," he observed. She looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him enter. "It's a way to understand the present," she replied. "To understand us." He nodded, walking towards her. He picked up one of the books, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. "The past is important," he said. "It shapes us, defines us. But it does not have to control us." "But how can we escape it?" she asked. "How can we break free from the cycle of hatred and revenge?" He looked at her, his eyes intense. "By choosing a different path," he said. "By forging a new future, a future built on trust, on forgiveness, on love." The word hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Juliana's heart beat faster. She was drawn to his vision, to the possibility of a future free from the shadows of the past. But could she trust him? Could she believe in his sincerity? Or was he simply using her, manipulating her, to achieve his own ends? "I've been reading about Isabella DeLuca," she said, changing the subject, trying to regain her composure. "My great-grandmother. Her story, it's tragic." Salvatore's expression darkened. "Isabella," he said, his voice tight. "Her death was a tragedy. A betrayal that poisoned our families for generations." "But who betrayed her?" Juliana asked. "The records are unclear. The Costas blamed the DeLucas, but he interrupted her, his voice sharp. The DeLucas were responsible," he said. "They could not bear to see our families united. They feared the power we would wield together." "But there's no proof," she insisted. "It's all speculation, accusations based on grief and anger." He slammed the book down on the table, his eyes flashing. "It is not speculation," he said, his voice rising. "It is the truth. My grandfather told me the stories, passed down from his father, from his grandfather before him. The DeLucas were treacherous, deceitful." Juliana stood her ground, meeting his anger with her own. "And the Costas were innocent?" She challenged. Your family has its own history of violence, of betrayal. You cannot claim the moral high ground. They stare at each other, their anger a palpable force in the room. The echoes of the past, of Isabella's betrayal and the ensuing bloodshed, seemed to reverberate around them, fueling their conflict. For the first time since her arrival, Juliana felt the full force of his temper, the simmering rage that lay beneath his carefully controlled exterior. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. She was finally confronting him, challenging him, refusing to be intimidated by his power. But beneath the anger, another layer had cracked, a vulnerability exposed. The feud was not a business deal to him, it was a wound, passed down like a cursed heirloom. And she had just pressed directly on it. Chapter 6. Beneath the Velvet Gloves. The tension in the library hung thick and heavy, the air crackling with unspoken accusations and generations of ingrained animosity. Juliana held Salvatore's gaze, refusing to back down, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the raw fury in his eyes, the barely controlled rage that simmered beneath his usually composed surface. It was a glimpse beneath the velvet gloves, a stark reminder of the dangerous power he wielded. He took a step closer, his presence dominating the space between them. You dare question my family's honor? He asked, his voice a low, menacing growl. I question the version of history you've been taught, Juliana retorted, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. A history written in blood and fueled by vengeance. A history that benefits no one but those who seek to perpetuate the conflict. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, the thought sending a jolt of fear through her. But then, slowly, the anger in his eyes receded, replaced by a flicker of something else. Something that looked almost like respect. He took a deep breath, visibly regaining control of his emotions. You have courage, Juliana, he said, his voice still tight, but the menace gone. I will give you that. But courage without wisdom is dangerous. And wisdom without compassion is cruel, she countered, her voice softening slightly. We cannot continue to live in the past, Salvatore. We cannot allow the hatred of our ancestors to dictate our future. He turned away from her, walking towards the window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sea, his silhouette framed against the fading light. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. My father, he said, was a hard man. He believed in strength, in power, in the absolute necessity of maintaining our family's dominance. He taught me that the DeLucas were our enemies, that they could never be trusted, that they deserved only our contempt. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and regret. But he also taught me about honor, about loyalty, about the importance of protecting those under my care. And you, Juliana, you are now under my care. The words, spoken with such quiet intensity, sent a shiver down her spine. It was the closest he had come to admitting any vulnerability, any doubt about the path he had been forced to follow. I don't want your protection, Salvatore, she said, her voice barely a whisper.
I want a partnership.
A chance to build something new, something better than the legacy of hatred we've both inherited. He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. And you believe that is possible? He asked. After everything that has happened? After the blood that has been spilled? I have to believe it's possible, she replied, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Otherwise, what is the point? What are we fighting for? He walked towards her, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, sending a wave of warmth through her. You are a remarkable woman, Juliana DeLuca, he said, his voice husky. You challenge me, you provoke me, you intrigue me. She looked up at him, her heart beating faster. The anger, the tension, had dissipated, replaced by a different kind of energy, a spark of something that felt dangerously close to attraction. He leaned closer, his eyes locking with hers. Perhaps, he murmured, his breath warm on her skin, perhaps you are right. Perhaps there is another way. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a question rather than a demand, a fleeting moment of contact that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She didn't pull away, didn't resist. She simply met his kiss, her lips parting slightly under his. It was a brief, hesitant exploration, a tentative truce in the midst of a long and bloody war. But it was enough. Enough to shatter the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, enough to awaken a desire she had tried to deny, enough to make her question everything she thought she believed. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers, a question in their depths. She couldn't speak, couldn't break the spell. The library, with its ancient books and its echoes of the past, seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of fragile possibility. He had shown her the iron fist, but now, she was seeing the man beneath, the man capable of doubt, of regret, and perhaps even of love. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, a dangerous game she was increasingly willing to play. The kiss had changed everything, a turning point that left her breathless and yearning for more. Chapter 7. The Unseen Scars of Salvatore. The kiss lingered in the air between them, an unspoken promise, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their family's feud. Juliana felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and a surprisingly intense desire. She had expected resistance, anger, perhaps even violence, but not this tenderness. It was a side of Salvatore she had never glimpsed before, a vulnerability that both intrigued and unsettled her. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the villa shifted subtly. The formal courtesy remained, but there was a new undercurrent of awareness between them, a heightened sense of intimacy that crackled in the air like static electricity. Salvatore began to share more of himself, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the carefully constructed mask of the dawn. He took her riding along the coast, showing her the hidden coves and secluded beaches that only he knew. He told her stories of his childhood, of his love for the sea, of his early training in the ways of the famiglia. He spoke of his mother, a woman he clearly adored, a woman who had died when he was young, leaving a void in his life that had never been filled. He showed her his scars, both physical and emotional. The jagged line across his shoulder, a memento of a knife fight in his youth. The deeper, unseen scars left by his father's death, by the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon him at a young age, by the constant threat of violence that had always been a part of his life. Juliana listened, her heart aching for the boy he had been, the man he had become. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the yearning for connection, for something more than the cold, hard world of power and control he inhabited. One evening, they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. The air was warm and still, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the cliffs below. Salvatore was silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression pensive. Juliana sensed a darkness in him, a shadow that he couldn't quite shake off. "What is it?" she asked softly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that made her breath catch. "I sometimes wonder," he said, his voice low and husky, "if I am capable of happiness. If I am destined to repeat the mistakes of my father, to live a life of violence and regret." His vulnerability touched her deeply. She moved closer, her body pressing against his, offering a silent comfort. "You are not your father, Salvatore," she said, her voice firm. "You have a choice. You can choose a different path." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "And you believe that path includes me?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I believe we can create a different path, together," she said. "A path that leads to peace, to forgiveness, to a future we can both be proud of." He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver of desire through her. "You give me hope, Juliana," he said, his voice husky. "A hope I had almost forgotten was possible." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. This time, the kiss was deeper, more passionate, a claiming rather than a question. Juliana responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, her body melting against his. The kiss was a release, a surrender, a merging of two souls long separated by hatred and fear. It was a promise of a future where love might conquer all, where the legacy of blood could be washed away by the tide of a new beginning. But even as she lost herself in the moment, a small voice of doubt whispered in the back of her mind. Could she truly trust him? Could she believe in this fragile hope, this nascent love that was blossoming in the heart of darkness? Could she forget the past, forgive the sins of his family, and embrace a future that was still uncertain, still fraught with danger? The scars, both his and hers, were a constant reminder of the deep wounds that needed to heal. The journey was just beginning, and the path ahead was still shrouded in shadows. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to believe, to hope, to surrender to the intoxicating power of his touch, his kiss, his presence. The unseen scars were still there, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that they might, one day, fade away. Chapter 8. A dance of defiance and desire. The kiss on the terrace marked a turning point in Juliana and Salvatore's relationship. The walls of formality and suspicion began to crumble, replaced by a hesitant, fragile intimacy. They spent more time together, sharing meals, conversations, and stolen moments of closeness that sent a thrill of both excitement and trepidation through Juliana. She found herself drawn to his strength, his intelligence, his surprisingly dry wit. She admired his dedication to his famiglia, his unwavering loyalty to those he cared for. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders, and she felt a growing desire to share that burden, to ease his loneliness, to offer him the comfort and companionship he so clearly craved. But she also remained wary, cautious. She couldn't forget the past, the violence that had defined their family's relationship for generations. She couldn't ignore the whispers of doubt that still echoed in her mind, the fear that she was being manipulated, that she was falling into a trap from which there would be no escape. Salvatore, too, seemed to be struggling with his own internal conflicts. He was clearly drawn to Juliana, captivated by her spirit, her intelligence, her defiant refusal to be cowed by his power. He treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence, yet she could sense the possessiveness in his gaze, the underlying desire to control, to own, to make her completely his. He began to involve her more in the day-to-day running of the famiglia, seeking her advice on matters of business, listening to her opinions, valuing her insights. It was a subtle test, a way of gauging her loyalty, her understanding of the intricate web of power and obligation that defined their world. Juliana navigated this new role with a mixture of caution and determination. She was careful not to overstep, not to challenge his authority directly, but she also refused to be a passive observer. She spoke her mind, offering her perspective, suggesting alternative solutions, always striving to find a balance between the demands of the famiglia and her own sense of morality. One evening, they were discussing a dispute with a rival family over control of a lucrative construction project. Salvatore was leaning towards a show of force, a violent demonstration of his power that would intimidate the opposition into submission. Juliana, however, argued for a different approach. Violence will only breed more violence, she said, her voice calm but firm. There must be another way, a way to negotiate, to compromise, to find a solution that benefits everyone. Salvatore looked at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. You are naive, Juliana, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. This is not a game of diplomacy. This is a war for survival. But it doesn't have to be, she insisted. We can choose a different path. We can break the cycle of violence. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. And you believe you can teach me how to do that? He asked, a challenge in his voice. I believe we can learn together, she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening his features, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. You are a constant surprise, Juliana De Luca, he said, his voice husky. You challenge me, you provoke me, You inspire me. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch sent a wave of warmth through her, a familiar spark of desire that ignited a fire within her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body swaying towards his. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, tender kiss, a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between them. But it was also a dance of defiance and desire, a delicate balance between their conflicting worlds, their opposing desires, their hesitant steps towards a future that was still uncertain, still fraught with danger. The dance was intoxicating, a dangerous game of push and pull, of surrender and resistance. She was defying the expectations of her family, of his family, of the entire world they inhabited. And yet, she couldn't deny the desire that pulsed through her, the magnetic pull that drew her closer and closer to this man who was both her captor and her lover. The word felt strange, forbidden, yet undeniably true. The defiance was a thrill, a rebellion against the constraints of her past, a bold step towards a future she was beginning to crave, a future that was inextricably linked with him. Chapter 9. The Price of Protection. The fragile peace that had settled over the villa was shattered by a sudden, unexpected act of violence. One of Salvatore's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Lorenzo, was found murdered, his body brutally displayed in a public square, a clear message from a rival family. The villa was thrown into chaos. Salvatore, his face a mask of fury and grief, immediately convened a meeting of his consiglieri, his inner circle of advisors. Juliana was excluded from the meeting, but she could hear the raised voices, the angry accusations, the calls for revenge. She paced restlessly in her room, her heart pounding with fear and anxiety. She knew that Lorenzo's death was not just a personal tragedy for Salvatore, but a direct challenge to his authority, a threat to the stability of the entire famiglia. It was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of their world, the constant danger that lurked beneath the surface of their carefully constructed lives. After several hours, Salvatore emerged from the meeting, his face drawn and haggard, his eyes filled with a cold, hard determination. He found Juliana in the garden, staring out at the sea, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off a chill. He approached her silently, his presence a comforting weight in the midst of her turmoil. Lorenzo was a good man, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Loyal, trustworthy, he did not deserve this. Juliana turned to him, her eyes filled with compassion. I'm so sorry, Salvatore, she said softly. I know how much he meant to you. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This was a message, he said, his voice tight. A warning. They are testing me, trying to provoke me, to see if I am weak. Who? Juliana asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who did this? He hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenching. The Salernos, he said finally. A family from Naples. They have been encroaching on our territory, trying to expand their influence. The Salernos. Juliana had heard the name whispered in hushed tones, a family known for their ruthlessness, their brutality, their utter disregard for the traditional codes of the famiglia. What will you do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. I will retaliate, he said, his voice cold and hard. I will show them that I am not to be trifled with. I will make them pay for what they have done. Juliana's heart sank. She had hoped that he might choose a different path, that he might heed her pleas for diplomacy, for compromise. But she knew that in this world, weakness was a death sentence. He had to respond, to defend his honor, to protect his famiglia. There has to be another way, she pleaded, her voice desperate. Violence will only lead to more violence. It will never end. He shook his head, his expression grim. There is no other way, Juliana, he said. This is the price of protection. This is the reality of our world. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the cold fury in his eyes. I will protect you, Juliana, he said, his voice husky. I will keep you safe. That is my promise to you. But his words, meant to reassure her, only filled her with a deeper sense of dread. She knew that his protection came at a price that would be paid in blood, in violence, in the perpetuation of the very cycle she had hoped to break. She was caught in a web of loyalty and obligation, bound to a man who was both her protector and her captor. The price of protection was steep, and she was beginning to understand the true cost. His promise, while comforting, was also a chain, binding her to a life she wasn't sure she wanted, a life where violence was the answer and peace was a distant, unattainable dream. She looked into his eyes, seeing the conflict within him, the struggle between his desire for revenge and his affection for her. It was a battle she knew he was destined to lose, and she with him. Chapter 10. Secrets Etched in Stone. The villa felt different after Lorenzo's murder. A heavier silence had fallen, punctuated by the hushed, urgent conversations of Salvatore's men. Security was tightened, and Giuliana's already limited freedom was curtailed further. She was confined to the villa grounds, her movements constantly monitored. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but deprived of the freedom to fly. Salvatore was preoccupied, his mind consumed by the need for revenge. He was distant, his usual attentiveness replaced by a brooding intensity that kept her at arm's length. She understood his grief, his anger, his need to assert his dominance, but she also mourned the loss of the fragile intimacy they had begun to build. Seeking solace, Giuliana returned to the library, drawn to the solace of the past, the escape offered by the stories contained within the ancient books. She resumed her research into the history of the De Luca and Costa families, hoping to find some clue, some forgotten detail that might offer a way out of the endless cycle of violence. One afternoon, while searching through a dusty collection of old letters, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment in one of the bookshelves. It was a small, secret space, concealed behind a panel that blended seamlessly with the surrounding wood. Intrigued, she carefully opened the compartment, revealing a small, leather-bound diary. The diary was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The cover was embossed with a single, elegant letter, I, Isabella. Giuliana's heart skipped a beat. This was Isabella De Luca's diary, the personal journal of the woman whose murder had ignited the feud that had consumed her family for generations. With trembling hands, she opened the diary, her eyes scanning the delicate, flowing script. Isabella's voice, silenced for over a century, spoke to her from the pages, revealing a young woman full of life, of love, of dreams for a future that had been tragically cut short. Isabella wrote of her love for Alessandro Costa, of her excitement about their upcoming marriage, of her hope that their union would bring peace to their families. She described Alessandro as a kind, compassionate man, a man who shared her vision of a future free from violence and hatred. But she also wrote of her fears, of her doubts, of the whispers of opposition to the marriage, of the threats she had received from jealous rivals, from those who feared the power that a united De Luca Costa alliance would wield. As Giuliana read further, she discovered a shocking revelation. Isabella had not believed that the threats came from within the De Luca family. She suspected someone within the Costa Famiglia, someone close to Alessandro, someone who stood to gain from his death and the ensuing chaos. She had written of a secret meeting she had planned with Alessandro, a meeting where they would discuss her fears and devise a plan to protect themselves. But the meeting had never taken place. Isabella had been murdered before she could reach him. Giuliana's heart pounded in her chest. This diary was a bombshell, a piece of evidence that could rewrite history, that could challenge the long-held belief that the De Lucas were responsible for Isabella's death. She knew she had to show the diary to Salvatore, but she also knew that it would be a dangerous move. It would challenge his deeply ingrained beliefs, his family's version of history, the very foundation of his identity. She spent the rest of the day reading and rereading the diary, absorbing every detail, every nuance of Isabella's words. The secrets etched in stone, the secrets whispered in the old villa, were finally coming to light. The diary was a key to unlocking the truth, but it was also a weapon a weapon that could shatter the fragile peace they had begun to build, a weapon that could ignite a new wave of violence and bloodshed. As evening approached, she knew she could no longer keep this discovery to herself. The weight of the past and the potential for the future demanded that she share this secret, no matter the consequences. The diary felt heavy in her hands, a testament to a love lost and a truth buried for far too long. Chapter 11. The Thorns of Trust. Juliana found Salvatore in his study, a dimly lit room filled with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke. He was standing by the window, staring out at the darkened sea, his silhouette a stark outline against the faint glow of the moon. He looked tired, the lines of strain etched deep around his eyes and mouth. The weight of leadership, of the impending retaliation against the Salernos, was clearly taking its toll. She approached him silently, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He turned as he sensed her presence, his expression guarded, his eyes questioning. "Juliana," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What is it?" She held out the diary, her hand trembling slightly. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the library. In a hidden compartment." He took the diary, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of awareness through her. He examined the cover, his eyebrows raising in surprise as he recognized the embossed eye. "Isabella De Luca's diary," he said, his voice tight. "Where did you find this?" "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice gaining strength. "What matters is what's inside. It changes everything." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What does it say?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. "It says that Isabella didn't believe the De Lucas were responsible for the threats against her," she said. "She suspected someone within the Costa Famiglia, someone close to Alessandro." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "That is a lie," he said, his voice cold. "A De Luca fabrication, designed to shift the blame, to escape the consequences of their treachery." "Read it, Salvatore," she pleaded. "Read it for yourself." Her own words, her own fears, her own suspicions. "It's all there." He hesitated, his internal conflict visible in the tense lines of his body. He was torn between his deeply ingrained beliefs, his family's version of history, and the possibility, however slim, that he had been wrong. Finally, he opened the diary, his fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. He began to read, his eyes scanning the faded script, his expression slowly changing from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked almost like horror. Juliana watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was a pivotal moment, a turning point in their relationship, in the history of their families. The truth was a dangerous weapon, and she had just unleashed it, with no guarantee of the outcome. He read for a long time, his silence broken only by the occasional rustle of the pages. The room was filled with a heavy tension, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Finally, he closed the diary, his hand trembling slightly. He looked up at Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and pain. This changes everything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "If this is true, then everything I have been taught, everything I have believed is a lie." "It's the truth, Salvatore," she said softly. "Isabella's truth. And it's time we faced it together." He turned away from her, walking towards the fireplace, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He looked like a man defeated, a man whose world had just been shattered. "Who?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Who would have done this? Who within my family would have betrayed Alessandro, would have murdered Isabella?" Juliana approached him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, offering a silent comfort.
"I don't know," she said.
"But the diary, it mentions a name. A man named Riccardo. Alessandro's cousin." Salvatore's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock. "Riccardo?" he said, his voice incredulous. "That's impossible." Riccardo was Alessandro's most trusted advisor, his closest confidant. "Perhaps," Juliana said. "Or perhaps he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man consumed by jealousy, by ambition, by a desire for power." The thorns of trust were sharp, piercing deep. The revelation had shaken him to his core, challenging everything he thought he knew about his family, about his history, about himself. She had placed the truth in his hands, and now she could only wait and see what he would do with it. The past had been unearthed, and the present was about to be irrevocably altered. Chapter 12. A Storm of Revelation. The revelation of Ricardo's possible betrayal hung in the air like a thundercloud, threatening to unleash a storm of epic proportions. Salvatore, usually so composed, so in control, was visibly shaken, his world tilting on its axis. He paced the study, his hands clenched, his jaw tight, struggling to reconcile the ingrained narrative of his family's history with the shocking implications of Isabella's diary. Ricardo, he muttered, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. It cannot be. He was family. He was trusted. Juliana watched him, her heart aching for his pain, for the shattering of his illusions. She knew how deeply ingrained the feud was, how much it had shaped his identity, his beliefs, his very sense of self. The diary is compelling, Salvatore, she said softly. Isabella's voice, it's clear, it's honest, it's filled with a fear that feels real. He stopped pacing, turning to her, his eyes filled with a turmoil of emotions. And what am I to do with this truth? He asked, his voice raw. Am I to tear down everything I have ever known, everything my father taught me, everything my family has believed for generations? You are to seek the truth, Juliana replied, her voice firm. Wherever it may lead. Even if it's painful. Even if it challenges everything you hold dear. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. And what if this truth leads to more bloodshed? He asked. What if it ignites a new war, a war within my own family? Then we face it, Juliana said, her voice unwavering. Together, we find a way to heal the wounds, to break the cycle, to build a future based on truth, not lies. He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. He saw the strength in her eyes, the unwavering belief in the possibility of a different future, a future free from the hatred that had consumed their families for so long. He walked towards her, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. You are a force of nature, Juliana De Luca, he said, his voice husky. You challenge me, you inspire me, you give me hope. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was a brief, tender kiss, a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a bond that was now being tested to its limits. He pulled back, his eyes holding hers. I will investigate this, he said, his voice firm. I will find out the truth about Ricardo, about Isabella's death, about the history of our families. I will uncover the secrets, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. He called a meeting of his most trusted consiglieri, men he had known since childhood, men he believed were loyal to him above all else. He presented them with Isabella's diary, explaining its contents, revealing the shocking possibility of Ricardo's betrayal. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some were outraged, dismissing the diary as a De Luca fabrication, a desperate attempt to rewrite history. Others were skeptical, questioning the authenticity of the document, the motives of its author. But a few, the older, wiser members of the council, listened with open minds, recognizing the ring of truth in Isabella's words, seeing the parallels between the past and the present. Salvatore ordered a thorough investigation, demanding that every record, every document, every whisper of rumor be examined, scrutinized, verified. He tasked his men with uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how damaging it might be. The storm of revelation had begun. The villa was filled with a sense of unease, of suspicion, of betrayal. The past had risen from its grave, casting a long shadow over the present, threatening to shatter the fragile peace that had been so painstakingly built. Juliana watched as Salvatore wrestled with the demons of his family's history, knowing that the outcome of this investigation would determine not only their future, but the future of the entire famiglia. The truth was a powerful weapon, and it had been unleashed, with consequences that were still unknown, still unfolding. The air was thick with anticipation, with the dread of what might be revealed, with the hope that somehow, out of the chaos, a new order could emerge. Chapter 13. The Cracks in the Foundation. The investigation into Ricardo's past consumed Salvatore. He became withdrawn, obsessed with uncovering the truth, spending hours poring over old records, interviewing elderly members of the famiglia, piecing together the fragments of a story that had been buried for over a century. Juliana, though excluded from the official investigation, remained his confidant, his sounding board, his anchor in the storm of revelation that was swirling around him. She offered him comfort, support, and a perspective that was untainted by the ingrained biases of his family. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Ricardo began to mount. They discovered old letters, coded messages, financial records that pointed to a conspiracy, a plot to eliminate Alessandro and Isabella to prevent the union of the two families. They found witnesses, elderly servants, former soldati, who remembered whispers of Ricardo's jealousy, his ambition, his resentment of Alessandro's power, and his love for Isabella. They uncovered a hidden connection between Ricardo and the woman who had confessed to poisoning Isabella, a woman who had been dismissed as a jealous rival, a pawn in a larger game. It turned out she was Ricardo's cousin, a woman he had manipulated, used, and then discarded. The cracks in the foundation of Salvatore's world were widening, revealing a history far more complex, far more treacherous than he had ever imagined. He was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his family, his ancestors, were not the paragons of honor he had always believed them to be. One evening, he found Juliana in the garden, sitting by the fountain, the water cascading down the marble statues, the sound a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within him. He sat down beside her, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with fatigue and despair. "It's all true," he said, his voice hoarse. Isabella's diary, it was right. Ricardo, he was the one. He orchestrated the whole thing. Juliana reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch was a lifeline, a source of comfort in the midst of his pain. "I'm so sorry, Salvatore," she said softly. "I know how much this hurts." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Everything I believed, everything I was taught, it was a lie," he said. "My father, he knew. He must have known. And he perpetuated the lie. He fueled the feud. He used it to justify his own actions." "Perhaps," Juliana said gently. "Or perhaps he was a prisoner of his own past, blinded by his own grief, his own anger." He shook his head, his voice bitter. "There is no excuse," he said. "He chose to continue the cycle of violence, to perpetuate the hatred. And I followed in his footsteps. But you can choose a different path now," Juliana said, her voice firm. "You can break the cycle. You can make amends for the past." He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. "How?" he asked. "How can I possibly make amends for generations of bloodshed, for the pain and suffering my family has caused?" "By telling the truth," Juliana replied. "By revealing the truth about Ricardo, about Isabella, about the history of our families. By acknowledging the wrongs that were committed, by seeking forgiveness, by building a future based on honesty and respect." He was silent for a long moment, his internal conflict evident in the tense lines of his body. He was torn between his loyalty to his family, his desire to protect their legacy, and his growing awareness of the need for truth, for justice, for healing. He knew that the truth was a powerful force for change. The cracks in the foundation were irreparable, but that didn't mean a new structure couldn't be built, a stronger, more honest one. He looked at Juliana, her strength and belief a beacon in the growing darkness. It was a daunting task, a monumental challenge, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope that it might actually be possible. Chapter 14. Broken Vows and Shattered Dreams. Salvatore, armed with the truth about Ricardo and Isabella, made a momentous decision. He called a meeting of the entire famiglia, not just his inner circle but all the members from the highest-ranking capos to the lowest-ranking soldati. He intended to reveal the truth, to expose the lies that had fueled the feud for generations, to break the cycle of violence and hatred that had defined their existence. The meeting was held in the grand hall of the villa, a vast, opulent space that had witnessed countless gatherings, celebrations, and pronouncements over the years. But this meeting was different. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with a sense of impending change. Salvatore stood on a raised platform, his figure commanding, his presence radiating a quiet authority. He looked out at the assembled crowd, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his family, his friends, his soldiers. He saw the fear, the uncertainty, the ingrained loyalty that had bound them together for so long. He began to speak, his voice clear and strong, his words echoing through the hall. He told the story of Isabella and Alessandro, of their love, of their dreams for a future of peace and unity. He revealed the truth about Riccardo's betrayal, about his plot to murder Isabella and prevent the union of the two families. He presented the evidence, the letters, the coded messages, the witness testimonies, the irrefutable proof that had been uncovered during the investigation. He laid bare the lies, the deceptions, the manipulations that had fueled the feud for generations. The reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, anger, and denial. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the familiar narrative of De Luca treachery, of Costa honor. Others were outraged, feeling betrayed by their own family, by the lies they had been told, by the violence they had committed in the name of a false cause. A few, the younger generation, those who had grown up questioning the endless cycle of violence, felt a sense of relief, of liberation, of hope that a different future might be possible. Marco, who had been standing near the back of the hall, his face a mask of fury and resentment, stepped forward, challenging Salvatore's authority, accusing him of betraying the family, of siding with the enemy. "This is a De Luca plot," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "A fabrication, designed to weaken us, to destroy us.
Do not listen to him.
He has been seduced by the enemy, by the De Luca whore." Juliana, who had been standing beside Salvatore, her hand resting lightly on his arm, felt a surge of anger at Marco's words. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing, her voice clear and strong. "I am not a whore, Marco," she said, her voice ringing through the hall. "I am a De Luca, yes, but I am also a woman who seeks the truth, who seeks peace, who seeks a future free from the hatred that has consumed our families for too long." She turned to the assembled crowd, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "My father was murdered," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I do not seek revenge. I seek justice. I seek reconciliation. I seek a future where our children can grow up without fear, without hatred, without the constant threat of violence." Her words, spoken with such passion, such conviction, silenced the room. Marco stood alone, isolated, his accusations ringing hollow in the face of Juliana's powerful plea for peace. Salvatore stepped forward, his hand resting on Juliana's shoulder, his support both physical and emotional. "I have made my decision," he said, his voice firm. "I will not perpetuate the lies of the past. I will not continue the cycle of violence. I will seek a new path, a path of truth, of justice, of reconciliation." He turned to Marco, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "Marco," he said, "you are my friend, my brother in arms. But you are wrong. You are blinded by your ambition, by your hatred, by your refusal to accept the truth." He ordered Marco's arrest, charging him with insubordination, with inciting violence, with attempting to undermine the authority of the famiglia. It was a painful decision, a necessary step to break free from the past, to pave the way for a new future. The vows of loyalty, the dreams of power, had been shattered, replaced by the stark reality of a new beginning, a beginning fraught with uncertainty, but also with the promise of a lasting peace. The shattered dreams of the past lay in ruins, but from the rubble, a new hope was beginning to emerge. Chapter 15. The Weight of Unspoken Words. Marco's arrest sent shockwaves through the famiglia. While some supported Salvatore's decision, seeing it as a necessary step towards a more peaceful future, others were deeply troubled, viewing it as a betrayal of their traditions, a weakening of their power. The unspoken words, the doubts and fears, hung heavy in the air, creating an undercurrent of tension and uncertainty. Juliana felt the weight of those unspoken words, the pressure of being the outsider, the catalyst for this dramatic shift in the famiglia's dynamics. She knew that many blamed her, seeing her as a disruptive influence, a DeLuca who had seduced Salvatore and led him astray. She tried to ignore the whispers, the sidelong glances, the veiled accusations, but it was difficult. She felt isolated, alone, despite Salvatore's unwavering support. Salvatore, too, was struggling with the fallout from his decision. He had challenged the very foundations of his family's identity, and he knew that it would take time, effort, and a great deal of patience to heal the wounds, to rebuild trust, to forge a new path forward. He was also dealing with his own internal conflict, the guilt and remorse he felt for his past actions, for the violence he had committed in the name of a lie. One evening, Juliana found him in his study, staring out at the darkened sea. He looked weary, the lines of strain etched deep around his eyes. She approached him silently, her presence a comforting warmth in the cold, sterile room. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I sometimes wonder," he said, his voice hoarse, "if I have done the right thing. If I have unleashed a storm that will destroy everything I have ever known, everything I have ever worked for." She moved closer, her body pressing against his, offering a silent comfort. "You did what was right, Salvatore," she said, her voice firm. "You chose truth over lies, justice over revenge, peace over violence. That is always the right thing to do." He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. "But at what cost?" he asked. "The famiglia is divided, Marco is imprisoned, and I have alienated many of those who were once loyal to me." "Change is never easy, Salvatore," she said. "It's always painful, always disruptive. But it's also necessary. You cannot build a new future on the foundations of the past, on the lies and hatred that have fueled the feud for generations." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I know you're right," he said. "But it's difficult. I feel like I'm walking a tightrope with the abyss on either side." She reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. "You're not alone, Salvatore," she said, her voice husky. "I'm here. We'll walk this tightrope together." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, tender kiss, a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a bond that was now their only anchor in the midst of the storm. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a release of the tension, the fear, the uncertainty that had been building within them. It was a silent promise, a vow of loyalty, a shared commitment to face the challenges ahead, together. But even as they clung to each other, the weight of unspoken words, of the doubts and fears, of the potential for betrayal, hung heavy in the air. The future was uncertain, the path ahead was fraught with danger, but they were committed to facing it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. The unspoken words, the doubts and the accusations, were a heavy burden, but their shared commitment was a strength that they hoped would see them through. They held on to each other, finding solace in the midst of the chaos, their love a fragile flame flickering in the darkness. Chapter 16. A flicker of hope in darkness. Despite the internal turmoil within the famiglia, Salvatore began to take concrete steps towards reconciliation with the DeLucas. He reached out to distant relatives of Juliana's, those who had been ostracized or marginalized because of the feud. He offered them apologies, reparations, and a chance to rebuild their lives, free from the shadow of the past. It was a slow, difficult process. Many were skeptical, distrustful, unwilling to forgive the sins of the Costas. Others were cautiously receptive, intrigued by Salvatore's offer, yearning for an end to the generations of conflict. Juliana played a crucial role in this process, acting as a bridge between the two families, using her knowledge of both worlds, her empathy, and her unwavering commitment to peace to build trust, to foster understanding, to heal the wounds of the past. She organized meetings, facilitated conversations, mediated disputes, patiently and persistently working to overcome the decades of hatred and mistrust. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, but she persevered, driven by her belief in a better future, by her love for Salvatore, by her determination to honor her father's memory, by ending the cycle of violence that had claimed his life. One evening, they held a small gathering at the villa, inviting a handful of De Luca relatives who had expressed a willingness to explore the possibility of reconciliation. It was a tense, awkward affair at first, the two sides eyeing each other warily, the unspoken accusations and resentments hanging heavy in the air. But Juliana, with her grace, her charm, her genuine warmth, managed to break the ice, to create a space for dialogue, for understanding, for the beginnings of forgiveness. She shared stories of her father, of his desire for peace, of his regret for the violence that had marred their family's history. Salvatore, too, spoke with sincerity and humility, acknowledging the wrongs that had been committed by his family, expressing his remorse, and outlining his vision for a future of cooperation, of mutual respect, of shared prosperity. Slowly, gradually, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The initial hostility gave way to cautious curiosity, then to a tentative willingness to listen, to understand, to consider the possibility of a different future. By the end of the evening, a small but significant step had been taken. A few tentative handshakes were exchanged, a few hesitant smiles were shared, a few words of forgiveness were spoken. It was a flicker of hope in the darkness, a fragile seed of peace planted in the barren soil of generations of hatred. Salvatore and Juliana walked their guests to the door, thanking them for their willingness to attend, expressing their hope for continued dialogue, for a future of reconciliation. As they stood on the steps of the villa, watching their guests depart, Salvatore turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "You did it," he said, his voice husky. "You made them listen. You made them believe." She smiled, a weary but genuine smile.
"We did it, Salvatore," she said.
Together. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the power he wielded, to the violence he had known. "You are a remarkable woman, Juliana De Luca," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You have brought light into my darkness, hope into my despair, love into my heart." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, tender kiss, a promise of a future they were building together, a future that was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges, but a future that was now filled with the possibility of peace, of forgiveness, of love. The flicker of hope was small, fragile, but it was there, burning brightly in the darkness, illuminating their path forward. It was a testament to their courage, their determination, their unwavering belief in a better future, a future that was slowly, painfully, but surely beginning to take shape. Chapter 17. The Unraveling of Loyalty. Despite the progress towards reconciliation with the De Lucas, internal dissent within the Costa Famiglia continued to simmer. Marco's imprisonment had not silenced his supporters. If anything, it had fueled their resentment, their belief that Salvatore had betrayed the family, that he had been corrupted by Juliana. Secret meetings were held. Whispers of conspiracy circulated. Plots were hatched to undermine Salvatore's authority, to restore the Famiglia to its former glory, to reignite the feud with the De Lucas. Salvatore was aware of the unrest, of the potential for rebellion. He had his loyal men, his trusted consiglieri, watching, listening, gathering intelligence. He knew that he was walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could plunge the Famiglia into civil war. One evening, one of Salvatore's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Antonio, a coincidence of names that did not go unremarked, came to him with disturbing news. He had uncovered evidence of a plot to assassinate Salvatore, to replace him with a leader who would be more amenable to Marco's faction, a leader who would resume the war with the De Lucas. The plot was elaborate, well-funded, and involved several high-ranking members of the Famiglia, men Salvatore had known and trusted for years. The betrayal cut him deeply, shaking his faith in the bonds of loyalty that had always been the bedrock of his world. He called a meeting of his remaining loyal consiglieri, sharing the intelligence he had gathered, outlining the threat they faced. He knew that he had to act swiftly and decisively to neutralize the plot, to prevent bloodshed, to preserve the fragile peace he had begun to build. Juliana, who had been present at the meeting, listened with growing horror as the details of the plot were revealed. She saw the pain in Salvatore's eyes, the betrayal he felt, the burden he carried. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his expression grim. "I have no choice," he said. "I must eliminate the threat. I must protect the Famiglia, even if it means killing those who were once my friends, my brothers." Juliana's heart sank. She had hoped that they could find a way to avoid further violence, to resolve the conflict peacefully. But she knew that in this world, weakness was a death sentence. He had to act, to defend himself, to protect the future they were building together. "There has to be another way," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "Can't you talk to them? Reason with them? Offer them a chance to repent?" He shook his head, his expression sad.
"It's too late," he said.
"The plot is already in motion. They have made their choice. And I must make mine." He ordered his men to move against the conspirators, to arrest them, to bring them to him for judgment. It was a swift, brutal operation, carried out with ruthless efficiency. The villa, once a place of opulent beauty, became a scene of violence, of betrayal, of the unraveling of loyalty. The conspirators were captured, disarmed, and brought before Salvatore. He confronted them with the evidence of their treachery, his voice cold, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. They denied the accusations, claiming their innocence, pleading for mercy. But Salvatore was unmoved. He had made his decision. The unraveling of loyalty had reached its climax. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He looked at Juliana, her presence a silent question and a plea. He knew what she wanted, but he also knew what he had to do to survive, to maintain control, to protect their fragile future. The line between justice and revenge had blurred, and he was about to cross it. Chapter 18. Redemption's Delicate Embrace. The captured conspirators were held in the villa's wine cellar, a cold, damp, and dimly lit space that served as a makeshift prison. The air was thick with the scent of old wine and the palpable fear of the men who awaited Salvatore's judgment. They knew the code, the consequences of betrayal. They knew that their lives hung in the balance. Salvatore, despite his outward calm, was wrestling with his conscience. He knew that the traditional code of the Famiglia demanded death for treachery, but he also felt the weight of Juliana's pleas for mercy, for a different path, for a future free from the endless cycle of violence. He was torn between the demands of his past and the hopes for his future. Juliana, unable to bear the thought of more bloodshed, pleaded with Salvatore one last time. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Killing them will only perpetuate the cycle of violence. It will not bring peace. It will not heal the wounds." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "What would you have me do, Juliana?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Let them go? Allow them to continue plotting against me, against us?"
"No," she said.
"But there are other ways to punish them. Exile them. Banish them from the Famiglia. Take away their power, their influence, their ability to harm you. Show them mercy, Salvatore. Show them that you are different, that you are building a new world, a world where justice is tempered with compassion." He was silent for a long moment, his internal conflict evident in the tense lines of his body. He knew that she was right, that killing the conspirators would only perpetuate the cycle of violence, but he also feared that showing mercy would be seen as weakness, that it would embolden his enemies, that it would undermine his authority. Finally, he made his decision. He would spare their lives, but he would not let them go unpunished. He would exile them, stripping them of their rank, their wealth, their connections to the Famiglia. He would send them away, far from Naples, far from the world they had known, to live out their lives in obscurity, a constant reminder of the price of betrayal. He summoned the conspirators to the Grand Hall, the same room where he had revealed the truth about Isabella and Ricardo. He stood before them, his figure commanding, his presence radiating a quiet authority, but this time there was a different quality to his demeanor, a hint of compassion, of mercy. He announced his decision, his voice clear and strong, his words echoing through the hall. He spared their lives, but he condemned them to exile, to a life of obscurity, to a permanent separation from the famiglia. The reaction was a mixture of relief, surprise, and resentment. Some were grateful for his mercy, recognizing that they had deserved death. Others were bitter, angry, feeling that they had been betrayed by their own leader. Salvatore ignored their reactions, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance. He had made his decision, and he would stand by it. He was breaking the cycle of violence, choosing a different path, a path of redemption, a path that was fraught with uncertainty, but also with the promise of a lasting peace. As the conspirators were led away, their faces a mixture of shame and defiance, Salvatore turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "You were right," he said, his voice husky. "There was another way." She reached out, her hand gently cupping his cheek. "You found it, Salvatore," she said. "You chose mercy. You chose peace." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, tender kiss, a promise of a future they were building together, a future that was now, finally, free from the shadow of the past, free from the endless cycle of violence and revenge. Redemption's delicate embrace had wrapped around them, offering a fragile but powerful hope for a new beginning. The choice had been made, the path had been chosen, and they were walking it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Chapter 19. The Reckoning of Hearts. With the internal threat neutralized and the conspirators exiled, Salvatore turned his attention to solidifying the fragile peace with the De Lucas. He knew that true reconciliation would require more than just words and gestures. It would require a deep, personal commitment, a symbolic act that would demonstrate to both families and to the wider world that the feud was truly over. He decided to formally propose to Juliana, not in the forced, possessive way he had done before, but in a genuine, heartfelt expression of his love, his respect, his commitment to a shared future. He wanted to make her his wife, not as a prize of war, but as his equal partner, the Donna to his Dawn, the mother of his children, the woman who had shown him a different path, a path of peace, of forgiveness, of love. He planned a romantic evening, a private dinner on the terrace overlooking the sea. He filled the space with candles, with flowers, with the soft strains of Italian love songs. He wanted to create a moment that was perfect, a moment that would be etched in their memories forever. Juliana, unaware of his plans, was surprised and delighted by the elaborate preparations. She dressed in a simple but elegant gown, her hair flowing loose around her shoulders, her heart beating with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. As they sat down to dinner, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold, Salvatore took her hand, his gaze holding hers. He spoke of his love for her, of his admiration for her strength, her courage, her unwavering belief in a better future. He spoke of his past mistakes, of his regret for the violence he had committed, of his commitment to a new path, a path he could only walk with her by his side. He then got down on one knee, holding out a ring, a stunning diamond that sparkled in the candlelight. It was a family heirloom, a ring that had been passed down through generations of Costa women, a symbol of their power, their influence, their legacy. "Juliana De Luca," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you share my life, my future, my heart? Will you help me build a new world, a world of peace, of justice, of love?" Tears welled up in Juliana's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that had survived betrayal, violence, and the weight of generations of hatred. "Yes, Salvatore," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking slightly. He stood up, pulling her into his arms, his lips claiming hers in a passionate kiss, a kiss that sealed their vows, a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that was witnessed by the stars, by the sea, by the ghosts of their ancestors. The reckoning of hearts had come. The past had been confronted, the present had been embraced, and the future was now theirs to create. It was a moment of triumph, of vindication, of the power of love to overcome even the most deeply ingrained hatred, the most bitter of feuds. The news of their engagement spread quickly, sending ripples of excitement, of hope, of cautious optimism through both families. It was a symbol of unity, of reconciliation, of a new era of peace and cooperation. But even as they celebrated their love, they knew that the challenges were not over. There were still those who opposed their union, who clung to the old ways, who dreamed of revenge. But they were ready to face those challenges, together, united by their love, by their commitment to a better future, by their determination to break the cycle of violence and hatred that had consumed their families for far too long. The reckoning had been painful, but it had also been liberating, freeing them from the shackles of the past, allowing them to embrace a future filled with hope, with promise, with the enduring power of love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The announcement of Salvatore and Giuliana's engagement, while a symbol of hope and reconciliation for many, ignited a final, desperate attempt by the remnants of Marco's faction to reclaim power and reignite the feud. They saw the impending marriage as the ultimate betrayal, the final nail in the coffin of their traditional way of life. Marco, though imprisoned, still wielded influence through his loyal followers. He had managed to smuggle messages out, inciting them to action, promising them rewards, fueling their resentment, urging them to strike a decisive blow against Salvatore and Giuliana before it was too late. The plan was audacious and brutal: to attack the villa during the engagement celebration, to kill Salvatore and Giuliana, to seize control of the famiglia, and to restore the old order, the old ways, the old hatreds. The engagement celebration was a lavish affair, held in the grand hall of the villa. Members of both the Costa and De Luca families were in attendance, a testament to the progress that had been made towards reconciliation. The atmosphere was festive, joyous, filled with music, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning. Salvatore and Giuliana, radiant in their happiness, greeted their guests, their love for each other evident in every glance, every touch, every shared smile. They were surrounded by well-wishers, by friends, by family, by those who believed in their vision of a future free from violence and hatred. But beneath the surface of celebration, a sinister plot was unfolding. Marco's men, disguised as caterers, waiters, and security personnel, had infiltrated the villa, their weapons concealed, their intentions deadly. They were waiting for the signal, for the moment to strike, to unleash chaos, to shatter the fragile peace that had been so painstakingly built. As the evening reached its climax, as Salvatore and Giuliana prepared to exchange their vows, the attack began. Gunfire erupted, shattering the joyous atmosphere, turning the celebration into a scene of terror and carnage. Chaos reigned. Guests screamed, running for cover, as bullets flew, as blood stained the elegant floors, as the villa, once a symbol of opulent beauty, became a battlefield. Salvatore, his instincts honed by years of living in a world of violence, reacted instantly. He shielded Giuliana with his body, pushing her to safety, drawing his own weapon, returning fire. He was joined by his loyal men, by those who believed in his vision of a new future, by those who were willing to fight and die to protect him and Giuliana. The battle was fierce, brutal, a desperate struggle for survival, for control, for the future of the famiglia. Giuliana, though terrified, refused to cower. She found a weapon, a small pistol that had been concealed in a nearby cabinet, and joined the fight, her aim surprisingly steady, her determination unwavering. She had come too far, fought too hard, to surrender to the forces of hatred and violence. The battle raged throughout the villa, the sound of gunfire echoing through the halls, the screams of the wounded and dying mingling with the cries of terror and despair. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fighting subsided. Marco's men, outnumbered and outgunned, were either dead or captured. The attack had been repelled, but at a terrible cost. Many lives had been lost, the villa was damaged, and the fragile peace had been shattered. Salvatore, wounded but alive, found Juliana amidst the chaos, her face streaked with soot and tears, her dress torn, her hands still clutching the pistol. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his relief overwhelming. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." But it wasn't over. Marco, having escaped from his prison during the chaos, emerged from the shadows, his eyes filled with a crazed fury, his weapon aimed at Salvatore and Juliana.
"You will not win,"
he screamed. "You will not destroy everything I have worked for. You will not betray the famiglia." He fired, the bullet heading straight for Salvatore. But Juliana, reacting instinctively, stepped in front of Salvatore, taking the bullet meant for him. She crumpled to the ground, her body limp, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Salvatore roared in anguish, firing his own weapon, killing Marco instantly. He knelt beside Juliana, his hands trembling as he cradled her head in his lap.
"No, Juliana, no," he cried.
"Stay with me. Please stay with me." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with love, with regret, with a peace that transcended the pain. "It's all right, Salvatore," she whispered, her voice weak.
"We tried.
We almost made it." Her eyes closed, her breathing stopped, and her body went still. Juliana De Luca, the woman who had brought light into his darkness, hope into his despair, love into his heart, was gone. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended in tragedy, a tragedy that would forever be etched in Salvatore's memory, a tragedy that would test his resolve, his commitment to the future they had dreamed of together. Epilogue. Salvatore stood on the cliff overlooking the sea, the same spot where Juliana had so often sought solace, the same spot where they had shared their dreams, their hopes, their love. The wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. He held a single white rose in his hand, its petals delicate, its fragrance a bittersweet reminder of the woman he had lost. He had buried Juliana in the De Luca family mausoleum, next to her father, a symbolic act of reconciliation, a testament to the love that had transcended the generations of hatred and violence. He had honored her memory by fulfilling her dream, by forging a lasting peace between the Costas and the De Lucas. He had dismantled the old structures of power, he had reformed the famiglia, he had created a new world, a world where justice was tempered with mercy, where cooperation replaced conflict, where love had a chance to flourish. But it was a world without Juliana, a world that would forever be tinged with sadness, with regret, with the aching void of her absence. He had avenged her death, he had ensured that Marco's faction was utterly destroyed, but it had brought him no solace, no peace. Only the slow, painful process of healing, of rebuilding, of honoring her memory by living the life they had planned together, could offer him any hope of redemption. He had adopted a young boy, the orphan son of one of the De Luca relatives who had been killed during the attack on the villa. He named him Antonio, after Juliana's father, and he raised him as his own, teaching him the values of compassion, of forgiveness, of the importance of breaking the cycle of violence. He had established a foundation in Juliana's name, a foundation dedicated to promoting peace, to supporting victims of violence, to educating future generations about the futility of hatred and the power of love. He had lived his life, a long and full life, dedicated to honoring Juliana's memory, to building the future she had envisioned, to making the world a better place, one small step at a time. But he had never forgotten her. He had never stopped loving her. He had carried her memory in his heart, a constant reminder of the woman who had changed his life, the woman who had shown him a different path, the woman who had sacrificed herself for him, for their dream, for their love. Now, as he stood on the cliff, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold, the same colors that had illuminated their engagement celebration, the same colors that had witnessed their final, tragic confrontation. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. He tossed the white rose into the sea, watching as it floated on the waves, a symbol of his enduring love, of his eternal gratitude, of his unwavering commitment to the future they had dreamed of together. "Goodbye, my love," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. "Until we meet again." He turned and walked away, his figure silhouetted against the fading light, a solitary figure, a man who had lost everything and yet had found a new purpose, a new meaning, a new life, a life dedicated to honoring the memory of the woman who had shown him the true meaning of love, of sacrifice, of redemption. He walked towards a future that was uncertain, but one he was determined to face with the courage and compassion Juliana had instilled in him. He walked towards a future where her legacy would live on, a legacy of peace, of forgiveness, and of enduring love. The sun had set, but a new dawn was breaking, a dawn illuminated by the memory of Juliana DeLuca, the dawn's captive rose who had bloomed in the heart of darkness. The end.